Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Ashley Portman. I am Food Tank's social media manager. And today I'm super excited about introducing you to Ann Tutwiler, who is the Director General of Biodiversity International, a global research for development organization that focuses on using and safeguarding agricultural and tree biodiversity to attain sustainable global food and nutrition security. So how can we ensure that 9 billion people will have access to a nutritious and healthy diet that is produced in a sustainable manner by 2050? This is the global challenge ahead of us, and despite major advances, our global food system still fails to feed a significant part of humanity. Today, Anne will be explaining to us why putting diverse, high-quality, nutritious foods back into the food system is a win-win for nutrition and sustainable food production. And we're truly honored to have you here today. And just a few things before we begin. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com afterwards. And you can also follow along and participate on Twitter using a hashtag foodtank. And please submit your questions using the questions tab in your control panel or email them directly to me at ashley@foodtank.com. And so without further ado, Anne, as I mentioned, we're thrilled to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation. I will give you the floor now.
Right, thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you to Food Tank for inviting me to participate in this webinar series. I think the presentation I'm about to give is very appropriate as this is School Lunch Month, and the Tale of Two Cities that I'm going to talk about actually incorporates using school feeding programs in both cases to help us use biodiversity for improving nutrition. So let me talk first about the two major global challenges that we are facing. You mentioned one, the challenge of feeding 9 billion people, but I think we need to focus also on the fact that in addition to providing calories for those individuals, we also need to provide them with nutrition. And we have really a triple burden of malnutrition now. We have 2 billion people who have micronutrient deficiencies, another 2 billion who are roughly who are overweight, and then about 800 million people who are food insecure. So if we think these are problems of poor countries, they are not. We have problems with child stunting, which is a marker for poor malnutrition in many countries, including some that we think of as middle income. And then, of course, obesity is a challenge facing all countries in the world, not just the developed countries. The other challenge I would like to focus on is the fact that we currently rely on a very narrow base of crops for our nutrition. A recent study by the Kew Gardens estimates that we have about 5,500 crops that have been used by people over history, yet only 3 of those crops provide more than half of our daily nutrition from plants, daily calories from plants. And if you take another 9 crops plus 5 animal species, that is 75% of the world's calories around the world today. And what we're seeing is not just this narrowing of diversity, but also a real convergence of diets around the globe. So countries, even those who are more developing countries, are moving towards a more westernized monocrop type of diet. So the good news is that we have a growing interest in neglected crops and highly nutritious foods. These are just a few of them: quinoa, kale, and I didn't mention bambara nut, but that's another one that's making the headlines. But unfortunately, these high potential foods are not in people's diets in the countries where they originate. What we see in many poor areas of developing countries is a very monotonous diet. that, like this example in India, um, is deficient in vitamin A, iodine, and iron in countries that have high rates of these deficiencies in the population. And the same is true in Kenya. So the question is, how can we move from this kind of rather monotonous diet to a more diversified diet like the one we see here pictured from Vietnam? So first of all, we need to be counting more than calories. So this chart, instead of just counting the caloric yield or the tonnage yield from an acre, demonstrates how many people could be fed on a hectare of land over a year based on energy, protein, iron, etc. So just to take a little an example for on energy. So a hectare of rice will deliver the nutritional energy requirements for approximately 20 people in a year. Millet would provide only about 5 people with sufficient calories. However, if you look at the graph on iron, you see that rice will only provide about 7 people or so with sufficient iron in a year, whereas millet is about double that. So this is not saying millet is a substitute for rice, but we need to look at not just how many calories a hectare of land is producing when we're thinking about our goals, but also looking at the micronutrients and levels of protein that hectare might produce. So another answer is, of course, to grow more vegetables. And this is an estimate on a worldwide basis. And you can see that we are, on a global basis, providing 468% of our global needs, but we're below where we should be producing on fruits and vegetables, as well as nuts and seeds. So this makes it very difficult for people to get a healthy diet if we're just not growing enough and prices are high or the food is inaccessible. So I'd like to turn with that kind of a background to 2 countries where we have been working for a number of years and talk about what we've been doing and how we've been doing it. So in India, I'd like to talk about how we have been mainstreaming millets into the food system. So in India, like many middle-income countries, they have made good progress on a national level against stunting. But you can see by the chart on the right-hand side of your screen, we still have incredibly high stunting rates in India among the poorest and the second poorest people in the country. And across India, as the recent Global Nutrition Report stated, we have almost 40% of children who are stunted. So minor millets used to be quite common in India. In fact, the new head of our India office told me that there's a 300-year-old proverb that links eating millet with improved health. But over time, the millets have been replaced by rice as a staple grain, which now covers about 1/4 of the total cropped area for India and provides food to about half of the population. The millet cultivation started falling out of favor during the Green Revolution, when wheat, rice, and maize were promoted by the Green Revolution. And in the past decades, the public distribution system in India provides rice and wheat at subsidized rates to low-income households, which has further discouraged the use of millets in that country. So over the period from 1961 to 2009, we've seen a decline in millet cultivation from about 700 million hectares to just over 3 million hectares. So sometimes these are called minor millets because we haven't seen a lot of research dedicated to these crops, and there's a limited commercial importance in many countries, but they are certainly not minor in terms of their nutritional and income properties. In addition, these are quite hardy and resilient crops to various agroclimatic conditions, including poor soil fertility, limited rainfall, and they're also quite well adapted to marginal agricultural conditions in the hilly and arid regions of India, where sometimes the improved varieties of the major crops are not particularly well suited. So the other thing to note when we're talking about these minor millets is they're not all equal. So if you look, for example, comparing again rice, which has 346 calories per kilogram, but that delivers about 9 milligrams of calcium. Finger millet delivers almost the same calories, but 344 milligrams of calcium. And looking at iron, we also see quite a difference between rice and little millet, but also between little millet and finger millet. So we really not only just have to look at the category of millets, for example, but the different types of millets that are being grown in the country. So one of the projects that programs that Biodiversity has been working on for quite some time was bringing millets from farmers to forks. And what we have done is taken a very holistic value chain approach, and which started with encouraging farmers to grow millets in their fields through participatory plant breeding of preferred varieties, training, access to quality seeds, working with community seed banks, improving methods of cultivation and harvesting, and finally incorporating enhanced nutrition in communities. So this was a full value chain approach, a full community approach. And what we've seen is that by improving cultivation, farm management practices, we've seen crop yields increased by as much as 77%, with an income increase of about 50% for farmers who are producing and selling these millets. So one of the nice things about millets is that it is a crop that is widely grown by women. But one of the challenges for increasing production of millet was actually the amount of drudgery that women had to face in actually grinding these millets to be made into food products. So in addition to working on the agronomy side, we also worked with women's groups to develop new milling machines that actually have become small businesses for some of the women in the community, and worked with some private sector companies to develop products, convenient products that could be sold in the marketplace. Now, coming to school lunches, which I mentioned before, like in many countries around the world, we have taken the approach of including millets in school feeding programs, and we've been working with 12 districts in central and southern India, and testing what the impact would be of eating more millets. And we've seen not only improved weight, but also higher levels of hemoglobin over students who've been eating white rice. And this is important to note, because often we aren't able to get these kind of concrete blood results when we're looking at these nutrition trials. So this is a really concrete result that we think is quite important, quite telling. But even more telling was that 85% of the children actually liked the millet-based foods. So in addition to the school feeding program, we have also worked, and I should say all of this work was done with many, many partners in India. We have also worked with these partners to help provide the evidence base to include millets in India's National Food Security Act. So this means that in addition to wheat and rice that I mentioned at the beginning, millet will also be included in the subsidized feeding programs for the poorest people in India. And I'm happy to say that we, in particular, worked with Dr. Swaminathan on convincing the Indian government to incorporate these crops. So now I'd like to turn quickly to a second tale from Brazil, where we've been working on mainstreaming biodiversity for nutrition. So like in India, we see a similar pattern. Tremendous progress nationally in reducing stunting, but also still quite high levels of stunting among the poorest of the poor in India, in Brazil. So one thing that's important to note about Brazil, and I would say even India, is that agricultural biodiversity is quite important to Brazil. They have high rates of agricultural biodiversity, number of exotic species, but also, like in many countries, these have been falling out of use. The zero hunger strategy of Brazil gave us an important entry point to use agricultural biodiversity, both to support ecosystem services like water supply and soil fertility, but also to help drive innovation and climate change in the farming sector, and to provide positive outcomes for health and nutrition and food security. So this project is part of a larger program that called Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition that is being funded by the Global Environment Facility. And we are working, as you see there, in 4 countries. And I just want to give a focus on Brazil at the rest of this talk. So one of the crucial elements of this program has been to widen the knowledge base. So with biodiversity, working with our partners in Brazil, we've identified about 73 species and characterized them for their nutritional content. So what you see here is a native variety of goiaba from southern Brazil. It's a traditional fruit, not eaten very much anymore, but very high in fiber, very high in vitamin C. So we've gone through a number of species and provided kind of detailed information about the nutritional content. After then evaluating the types of crops that are available, could be available, we've evaluated the nutritional status of children in school feeding programs, worked to improve health education in school feeding programs, including the school gardens. And through this program, integrating nutrition more into the school feeding programs, we have a potential to reach more than 40 million students who are our future, the future consumers in Brazil. So again, just like in the India sample, we've also been working to integrate these kinds of foods, these highly nutritious foods and local or forgotten foods into the school feeding programs. And this has been particularly helped by some of the policies of the Brazilian government to support organic and local and agroecological food into those school feeding systems. And then finally, we just this year saw the Brazilian government pass an ordinance called the Socio-Biodiversity Ordinance in 2016, which is the first government ordinance to actually support the use of native species in institutional feeding programs, and to support not only the use of that, so its conservation in Brazil. So that's the end of my formal presentation. I think I'd like to put the point on the discussion table. What are further opportunities and challenges for using biodiversity to improve nutrition? I think one of the hurdles we often find when we talk to people about this is the lack of maybe a linear progression from one day eating more highly nutritious crop and the next month delivering higher nutrition rates. Whole of diet, whole of years feeding process is just not as linear as some people might prefer. So I'll leave that on the table and happy to take any questions from those who are listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was a really informative presentation. And we have a bunch of questions from the listeners. So for about the next 10 to 15 minutes, let's get through as many as possible. And my first question, or our first question, that comes from Megan from the US. She would like to know if there are any farming millet collectives that have been formed by women in India.
Well, we have been working quite closely, as I indicated, with women's groups in India, and I can't answer whether specifically they have created farming collectives, but these groups of women were working together to develop work with us to develop the milling equipment that I talked about, and also to provide input into these developing the products that I mentioned. So I would think many of the women are still continuing to work together in cooperative manners to grow these millets and to produce them.
Great, thank you, Anne. And Tamara asks, I'd like to ask what opportunities have you seen to improve nutrition in Africa? Have you heard of the Bambara groundnut? We're working on bringing it to market, but are concerned the crop's local stigma will hold us back. We are called Ag for Africa.
So, two parts to that answer. Yes, we are also working in Kenya on a similar program to what I described in Brazil, and are having similar success, not quite as rapid because the policy framework wasn't to some extent pre-existing, but we are working in Busia district with schools in that district, and a lot of interest and uptake already with that program. In terms of Bambara groundnut, we ourselves don't work with that particular crop, but certainly well aware that it is considered to be a very important nutritional crop by many. And I think what we have found in the many years that we have been working on building markets for these neglected and underutilized species, we often find that these are considered to be crops of the poor. And it really is important to start changing the image of these crops. So, for example, in Kenya, a number of years ago, we began working on trying to reintroduce more nutritious African leafy green vegetables into the diets in Nairobi and in Kenya. And one of the first things we had to do was change the image of these crops from this is what poor people ate with their ugali, to this is what everyone should eat because it's higher nutrition. And one of the things we did was to work with local chefs in Nairobi to get them to start incorporating these crops, these products into their menus. We convinced the parliament to begin serving these in parliament cafeterias. Sounds very small, but it's the kinds of things that you need to do to start changing the image. The same trajectory happened with quinoa, which we had been working with in the Andean highlands, and then you see chefs in Lima and La Paz integrating quinoa into their menus. So there's different ways you can change an image of a food, but it's really an important part of getting some of these crops reintroduced. Sorry for the long answer, but hope it was useful.
Thank you, Anne. And our next question comes from Leon Guaca, and he thanks you for your presentation and asks if you have found any or thought above any preservation techniques for the forgotten food or of native foods.
Yeah, so we have actually a program of work in the Andes, which we call Payment for Agricultural Biodiversity Services. So this is a modification of the Payment for Ecosystem Services, which many people might be familiar with, where we are working with the Peruvian government on determining basically how much a farmer would have to be paid in order to conserve some of these neglected and underutilized species. And in particular, quinoa is a good example because ever since we've had such popularity with quinoa, there's even a narrowing of diversity there. So it's important to find these custodian farmers. So that's one answer. The second answer, and we really believe that in many cases, the reason crops are not being conserved is because there is no use for them. So we believe by creating market demand, we can help to actually conserve these crops because they fall out of, when they fall out of favor in the market, they fall out of favor in production systems. So that's, I think, another important response.
Thank you, Anne. Another question coming in from Rucha. She asks, what other areas in the world will biodiversity be working in? And as well as how did the native people within that country react to your presence? And do you ever employ or work with the native people in the country?
Oh, so great question. So we work in roughly 35 countries around the world. If I had another presentation, I would show you our map. There are countries where we find a confluence of high levels of agricultural biodiversity, high levels of poverty, malnutrition, significant threat for climate change and challenges in climate adaptation. So if you go to our website, and maybe I'll just switch to the next slide if I can. If you go to our website, which is biodiversityinternational.org, you can see a map of where we're working. So we actually do most of our work through participatory science. And that means we work quite closely with communities. We have one program where we consider the farmers are citizen science, and they are contributing to our science, and they take great pride in being scientists. So we're working with farmers, not on them or to them, and that helps quite a bit in the relationship with the community and how we are sort of accepted and treated in that community. We do have coming up in not too long, we are going to be publishing as a scientific journal article, which will be co-authored by some of the farmers that we have been working with. And I think this is quite an amazing story to tell, that it's not just the PhD scientists who are putting their names on this science article. So I think we make a strong effort to work very closely with local communities and respect their knowledge, which I think is something very important.
Thank you, Anne. Another question from Niels. He or she says, great talk. Do you have any idea to what extent the concentration of micronutrients depend on the ability of a crop to accumulate these minerals, and to what extent to soil mineral content?
So thank you. This is not an area I can claim a lot of expertise, but I think we are seeing some results coming out about the important link between soil health, soil mineral content, and what is taken up by the crop. So when we're looking at the micronutrients in a crop, we do need to take it into account the soils in which those crops are being grown. And I think this is an interesting, area for future research is, how do we ensure that these highly nutritious crops that we know about actually are nutritious when they're finally delivered to the consumer.
Great. And Tesfaye asked, do you have any plan in the future to work on native food plants in Ethiopia?
I'm sorry, native what? What's the
Native plants in Ethiopia.
So we are working in Ethiopia right now on durum wheat, which maybe you don't think that's a native plant in Ethiopia, but in fact, Ethiopia is the secondary center of origin for durum wheat. And in our work in that country, we found that very little of the durum wheat that's being grown in Ethiopia actually contains Ethiopian germplasm. So one of the things we think is important for that country as it addresses its future climate challenges is to see how we can reintegrate some of that native germplasm. So we work on native crops in a number of countries, but aside from durum in Ethiopia, and we do some work on barley, but those are the two main ones in Ethiopia at the moment.
Okay, great. We have so many questions, and so if you're good, I'm going to ask you a couple more. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, wonderful. So the question comes in from Brazil, from Mariah, from Projeto Alimento in Brazil, and she asks if the impact of agrobusiness on agro biodiversity.
So I think it certainly has been, as we've seen, a focus on calories that and a move to a more standardized diet, I guess you would say, that there's been a synergy from how the farms are producing to the uptake of those products into our food supply. But what I would say in talking to a number of private sector companies, even some of the larger ones now, they are realizing that consumers want variety. Consumers want more nutrition. They want higher diversity in their diets. And so even some of the large companies are trying to think through how they can change what they're offering on the markets. But more than that, I think, we focus a lot of attention on these large companies because they have very visible names. But there are, in many countries, smaller entrepreneurs who are able to be more nimble in meeting this kind of consumer demand. So I think it's changing. I think we see as consumer demands start to change, we're going to see the interplay between farmers, the private sector mechanisms in countries supporting this. But we need to both help educate consumers and to encourage changes in how farmers produce. So you can't just focus on one side or the other.
Great, thank you, Anne. And Deirdre asks, how can the West support the promotion of traditional foods and a reverse nutrition transition?
So I think, I'm not sure quite where the questioner is asking about nutritional foods in developed countries or how the developed countries can help promote these in developing countries. But I think, even in the U.S., we're seeing quite a resurgence, as one of my earlier slides pointed out, in more local varieties, heirloom varieties, resuscitating kale, which I think our grandparents might have eaten, but nobody ate until quite recently. So we're starting to see that happening in westernized diets to some extent, and I think that can have an effect around the world because many people look to a Western diet, and that's what they aspire to. There is quite a movement, a group of organizations around the world who are supporting these neglected and underutilized species or forgotten crops, and and we're part of that, of course, with many others. And I think there's a real opportunity to create a movement here to focus on these lost crops and see how we can bring them back into production to address some of the challenges, Ashley, that you talked about at the beginning of your introduction.
Great, thank you, Anne. And our last question asks about the particular farming methods that are used that you see. Are they regenerative, organic, conventional?
So I think we see a mix of all of them. And some of our work is very much focused on how we can use agricultural biodiversity to help farmers manage pests and disease, for example. So, we're trying to find solutions where farmers can make biology work for them and not always have to turn to chemical solutions for managing pests, managing diseases, improving soil fertility. But I think we can see that in organic farming. We can see it in more sustainable farming systems, and I think even in some conventional systems, we can hope to incorporate some of these practices that will reduce the environmental footprint of some of the more conventional systems.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. And there is one more question that I will do since we have a couple more minutes. And this is more of a general question. From your experience, what are other countries that are extremely vulnerable in terms of malnutrition, as well as how can individuals in the West help to create more of a positive impact in supporting?
Well, I mean, there's so many countries in the world that have, that are very vulnerable to both types of malnutrition that I mentioned. It would be, I think, too difficult to even pick out a few names. I think one thing that many of us can do is a couple of things that I mentioned in the beginning, which is, one, how can we focus our research and our food systems around the provision of nutrition instead of only or in addition to calories. How can we focus the food systems around a better way of managing these trade-offs that we see sometimes between productivity and sustainability, or productivity and water quality, etc. Because I think we just aren't asking ourselves those questions very much. So one is to start asking ourselves different questions, setting ourselves different goals. I think the Sustainable Development Goals do help there. The second, frankly, is policy measures. I mentioned the school feeding programs in the two countries where we're working. But we have policies in many countries that favor the production of starches and oilseeds. And again, nothing wrong with trying to address the calorie concerns of people, but they don't always provide advantages for the production of more nutritious crops. And we also see subsidies, some kinds of input subsidies that also are biased towards the production of a very few number of crops. So I think we need to really take a look at our government policies in the developed and developing countries, and really take a hard look at how they are supporting improving nutrition and supporting more sustainable production.
Thank you, Anne. And there was a question from someone named Lucas, and the question a lot was you referenced a lot of what this question asked, which was what are Biodiversity's experiences with the perception of local governments and mainstreaming traditional food plans, as these resources are unfortunately often considered not innovative. And I just wanted to know if you wanted to touch on anything of that question before we end our session.
Well, yeah, it's a nice one to end on. I think it is a challenge because many of us are attracted to the next new thing and the very high-tech solutions that we have and that many research organizations have been putting forward. But I think frankly, we need to take more advantage of some of these tools. We can take advantage of some of the rapid breeding, rapid characterization tools that we have to look at genetic resources. We can take advantage of improved information systems to help farmers know what to plant, consumers know what to buy. But definitely sometimes when you talk about reintroducing a food that's been forgotten since the 1960s, there are some people who will say, well, that was old. Why are we bringing that back? That was traditional. So I do think there is a certain bias in all of us, I think, about what we look back to and what we want to bring forward into our world today.
Thank you so much, Anne. That concludes our webinar for today, and we're so grateful that you joined us and we learned so much. And we thank all of our listeners for sending in these amazing questions. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you to everyone again, and have a beautiful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.